Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Looks like everyone's getting connected to audio here. Alrighty. Well, we have a pretty packed day today, so we're going to get going. To start out with, thank you for coming back and hanging out with us for a third time virtually. This will be our last virtual meeting before the in-person event next week. And we're super excited to have you all here in Boulder and get to meet you all in person and yes, do some cool science, but also have some fun and play with some data. So today we have a few things that we're going to do. The first of which is I'm going to run through some of the data that we've made available for you. This will be a little bit less interactive than we had planned since our session last time took a little bit longer than expected. But this is what you'll be doing sort of throughout the entire Codefest. So you'll have a lot of time to play with this code, and any time between now and the Codefest that you want to spin up an instance and try playing with some of this code, you're more than welcome to. We're then going to hear some short lightning talks from a few of the people in this cohort on different perspectives on forest carbon, and then from our lovely Carol Westman on sort of bringing together some of those perspectives and thinking about the science that's underpinning a lot of what we're trying to get at through this Codefest. And then you will all have about half an hour to first meet your teams. We know that not everybody is here, and you'll have a lot of time during the Codefest to meet these individuals, collaborate with them, brainstorm about what you want to work on. We just wanted to provide this as a little bit of an initial opportunity for you to meet these people, get even the slightest sense of what people are excited by, and hopefully that conversation can continue over Slack between now and the event. So I'm going to get started with showing some data that we have made available. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. All right, I think that everybody can see that. And so this on the right here is the home Forest Carbon Codefest website that you all are used to seeing at this point. And this has a few new additions. One is that we now have a location with your teams. There's a link to each of your websites, and from that website, it's easy to get to your repo. So this can still sort of be a central location for you to go to. We have our pre-event virtual meetings, a breakout prompt that we'll talk about at the end of today, and then all of the resources on collaborating in the cloud that you saw last time. And I will actually put this in the chat for everybody so that you can view it and follow along also. And then today, what we're going to walk through is this Codefest data library. And we're using the term data library a little bit loosely here, in that we're using it to both describe a set of data that we have already downloaded and made available for you on the Cyverse data store, as well as sort of a set of tutorials showing you how to access additional data if you have something that you want to pull in that we haven't made available. A good example of this would be something like Sentinel or Landsat, where we weren't going to download the entire Landsat archive for the Southern Rockies and provide it to you, because that would be a lot. And there's also so many different ways that you might want to slice that. Maybe you want to be looking at annual averages or just growing season averages, and we didn't want to pull all of that for you. So that's something that we would want you to access on your own, and you can slice it and dice it however you would like. To start out, I'm just going to show you the data that we've already made available. And an important piece here is something that I mentioned last time, which is that we need to move data to your instance from the data store before accessing it. Need, I guess, is a strong word in that you could access it from the data store, but it's highly recommended that you copy it over, because it's going to take a lot less time to process once you've moved it. So just as a quick example here, I'm currently in this tutorial moving data from your instance to the data store. And one of the data sets that we've made available is the tree map data set, which we'll talk about in just a minute. And just to show you, I could run this code and it actually operates pretty quickly. It's going to plot, and that took about 4 seconds, which is quite fast, but we can get it to be quite a bit faster. So if we take this exact same code, and the only difference here is that I've added a call to copy this data from its location in the data store. So this is the location in the data store, and each data set that we'll be showing you has its directory listed on the data store, and I'm just moving it directly to my instance to a folder called tree map. And that's something that will run quite quickly. So it's not a huge amount of data, and so it's already done, we're just moving it to the instance that I've started up. And now if I do the exact same code, it took 0.4, 0.5 seconds. So at this scale, we're not seeing huge increases. I mean, it's a 10 times increase. And then if you think about trying to do more and more complex processing on this data, that time increase is going to add up incredibly quickly. So we really highly recommend moving data from the data store to your instance anytime that you want to process the data that we've already pulled for you. I'm going to pause right there. Are there any questions on sort of just that idea? Okay, I'm going to continue in that case. So seriously, just copy the data over. All right, and so some of the data that we've already pulled for you ranges from something like Jedi, where it can be a bit of a pain to access. So we've pulled this for you to make it a little bit easier. This is something that our amazing Nyani has already done, and you'll be hearing from her a little bit later today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Jedi, I'll give just a very brief overview, but there's additional information on each of these data sets on our website. Jedi is a joint mission between NASA and the University of Maryland, and it's an instrument aboard the ISS. This is a LiDAR system, which can create three-dimensional maps of forest canopy height. And it is a collection of footprints about 25 meters along the track of this, 25 meters diameter for each of the footprints, and each footprint is separated by about 60 meters along the track. And what we have made accessible for you is the Jedi footprint paste above ground biomass density product at for over the Southern Rocky Mountains area. This data is from 2019 to 2022, and they're in the form of tiled CSV files. This is the data location here. So just like I said, this is where all of the data is hiding on the data store. And we've provided some scripts in both R and Python showing how to access and manipulate some of this data. So I'm going to just pull this in right now and show you briefly that here I'm going to use not best practices because I'm just going to look at one of these CSV files. So I'm not copying it over yet. I'm just listing where the file's in the directory. Here's all of these different tiled CSVs. And I'm going to randomly choose one of these to look at for fun. I'm going to read this file, and I'm going to discard some of these values if we don't want to use them. So we're going to remove all of those. And then each of these footprints also has information from MODIS attached to it. And that is essentially the best guess from the MODIS data set of what that land cover is at the location of the footprint. So here's that PFT legend made available for you. And we're going to label each of those PFT classes. Nayani is an amazing person to talk to about Jedi if you have any questions during the Codefest. Nayani has worked a ton with this data. And an important thing is making sure to mask to only our high quality shots. So here we're going to filter to just a LF4 quality flag. And we also want to look at just our trees and shrubs PFT class. So if we mask this out and then plot it, you can see here a distribution of Jedi above ground biomass estimates by some of these different PFTs that we were interested in. So there's a little bit more to this that you could come and take a look at, but this is just a very quick example of how you would pull in one of these CSVs and start to manipulate it. The CSV does have the longitude of each footprint, so you can then tie this to any of the additional rasterized data sets that we're making available. All right, so another data set that we have already pulled in for you is tree map. This is a US Forest Service tree level model of the forests across the US, and it's based on data from FIA. So the forest inventory and analysis data set is a set of distributed plots across the United States run by the US Forest Service, and they have huge amounts of information on all of the trees, downed woody debris, pretty much anything you can think of within those plots. This tree map product is essentially a product taking each of those plots and a number of machine learning algorithms and trying to guess the best fit of each location across the United States for one of those plots. What's sort of our best example plot of that location? So that data then provides a raster with the ID numbers of different FIA plots, and that ID number can be connected to all of the data in the FIA database. So an overview of the data product can be found here if you want to look at it more. And so this is here. There's also, I need to hide there we go. There's also a dictionary of the PDF here. And you can see many of the different types of information that we can think about. Live tree basal area, live canopy cover, height of the dominant trees. So there's a lot of information here that you could potentially use. And if you wanted to access this from the data store, here I'm moving it because it's a little bit of a bigger raster. This is again the same thing that we looked at before where we will plot it. And we can see that there are about 80,000 different plot IDs across the United States. And so each of these locations is a forested area and the ID of the plot that matches it best. There's also a CSV that goes along with this that has information. So this TMID is the ID of the forest inventory plot that's associated. And you can see that for this single plot, we have each different tree that's there, the species, we have height, diameter, and lots of other information on that. So you all will have plenty of time to explore that during the Codefest, but I just wanted to sort of show you that that is there and this raster is already downloaded and easily accessible. We also have made it easy to access the FIA database. So this is raw FIA data, and we have prepared two different functions for you that will download FIA data directly to your cloud instance. So you can either download individual data files or you can bulk download a whole set of data files. For example, you could ask for all of the information for Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and you want all of the down woody material information. And by putting that into this function, so for example, we would call our function here, we would supply the state that we want, maybe it's just Colorado, the directory where we want to put our data, and then the bulk data types that we want. Maybe it's down woody material and the plot level data, and it will then download all of those into your directory. This also works pretty quickly, and we've made it so that it actually downloads to your instance so that you can sort of access those files on and off and explore them as you would like, since there are sort of just a huge number of files that will get downloaded with a bulk download like that. Again, there's a lot more that you can look at here, and there are a number of you in this group who are very familiar with FIA data. So if you have any questions, ask other people in your group, ask one of us, ask somebody who's not in your group but is an expert in this. In terms of disturbance data, there's a number of different types of disturbance data that we've pulled for you. One is disturbance stack, which is what we're calling a set of landfire data that we've turned into a fairly easily operable format, and then added a new type of hotter drought that we were interested in that research is showing has particular effects on tree mortality. So there's two different rasters that are available in this disturbance directory. And the first of those is the full version, which has 16 values ranging from 0 to 15. And each of those values corresponds to a type of disturbance that was listed in the landfire data set. So it might be none, fire, insect or disease, or other landfire disturbance. So this is things like tree blowdown, or even thinning and deforestation, and the hotter drought status that was exceeded. So this hotter drought is specifically thinking about at the hottest and driest time of the year, how many different drought thresholds were exceeded. These thresholds are things like VPD and temperature and lack of precipitation. So the most extreme of these would be all 6 of the thresholds that we were looking at were exceeded at that hottest and driest time of the year. There's also a simplified version of this stack. If you want to be working with fewer values, this only includes the most extreme hotter drought that we were looking at. So it either has none or all 6 thresholds were exceeded. And we've simplified this to just be fire and insect and disease. We also have pulled fire severity for all of these events. So some of you may be familiar with the composite burn index, which is a fairly commonly used ecologically meaningful measure of fire severity. And unlike some other measures, CBI is a lot more comparable across large regions. And to calculate this, we've used the method described in Parks et al., which you can read more about here, which essentially allows us to calculate CBI comparably across large areas. So this is also in the same disturbance directory and is a TIFF file that has been masked to only show the fire events that are in that landfire dataset. So this is a really good go-to for any fire severity information that you're interested in. We pulled some additional drought data for you as well. Some of you are familiar with SPEI and PDSI, which are 2 different types of drought indices. SPEI is a multi-scalar drought index based on climatic data. And as it's multi-scalar, we've provided it to you at the 30-day, 1-year, and 5-year timescales. PDSI is not multi-scalar, so this is just an annual average. Again, I'm not going into all the details of these because I just want to give you a taste of what we have available. But during the event, please ask us for additional information if you're excited about using some of these data sets. And also ask your teammates. Many of you are familiar with these data sets already. We have MODIS Vegetative Continuous Fields, or VCF, which is derived from the MODIS satellites. And this provides global subpixel estimates of 3 different land cover components, percent tree cover, percent non-tree vegetation, and percent non-vegetated within each pixel at 250 meter spatial resolution. This is an annual data set that we've also made available for the Southern Rockies, and it is located in this directory. And finally, we have LCMAP, which is the Land Change Monitoring, Assessment, and Projection Program, which is essentially a new generation of land cover mapping and change monitoring from the USGS. And this is available at this directory. It has essentially the many different types of land cover that you're familiar with seeing in something like the NLCD. Okay, so I only have a few more minutes here, and we'll talk about this a little bit more at the event itself. But we just wanted to give you a sense for the fact that there are additional ways to pull in other data. So the first is that we can mount data directly from any URL online. And that's something that we have full tutorials on here. So under this Codefest data library, there's a tutorial for mounting data directly from a URL, accessing data from Stack, and then sort of a few other examples of how to go about things. But mounting from a URL is basically taking advantage of the fact that the data is already hosted online. And we can access it using VSI, which is part of GDAL's virtual file system. So this allows us to access files hosted on remote servers via a variety of different protocols. And a benefit of this is that GDAL will then read that file directly from that remote location without downloading it entirely to your local disk. So it's really helpful, especially for really large files like rasters, since it will only fetch the portion that's needed for your current operation. We can also use VSI zip, which is another handler in GDAL that allows us to access files inside of zipped archives as though they were unzipped. So we can actually just directly access it. And I am not going to run through this right now, but you can certainly walk through it. But essentially, we need to know the exact, so we need our URL, and then we need to know what the name of the files inside of it are. And then we can mount that data just like we normally would from any other directory or location by adding this VSI zip, VSI curl before the URL, and then by including the name of our file within that zipped location. And then we could just read it within R or Python in just the normal way that we would read that file. I'm going to take one more minute. And again, I'm not going to run through this tutorial. This is accessing data via Stack. But just to make you aware that there is something called the Spatiotemporal Asset Catalog. And it makes it so that we can access huge amounts of data via API. And most of this is rasterized data like Sentinel and Landsat that we can then set our resolution and the temporal and spatial areas that we're interested in. And we can pull that directly onto our instance. At the beginning of our event, we hopefully will have a moment to run through this, but essentially we can go and find an area of interest anywhere in the world that we want. We can search the stat catalog. There are hundreds of stat catalogs out there, and those can be found online. And then you can request a specific view of that data. By requesting that view, for example, here in this tutorial, I'm setting the resolution that I want. I'm setting the spatial and temporal aggregations, and then the temporal and spatial areas that I want. And then essentially just pulling this in and calculating an NDVI. This entire code script can run in, I think, about 3 minutes. And it's for the entire Sentinel archive over the Southern Rocky Mountains, aggregating it to 100-meter pixels, and then calculating NDVI. So this is an extremely powerful tool that you can use to access additional data if there's things that we haven't provided, but you really want to use. So with that, I am going to stop talking and let you hear from some of our other fantastic participants that you will get a chance to interact with during our event. And we are going to start off with Max Joseph from Planet Labs. As soon as I can figure out how to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be looking off to the side because I have another monitor here. But yeah, I'm going to spend 5 minutes briefly talking about how our team, the forests team at Planet, estimates forest structure at scale. As soon as I can throw my slides up.
Yeah, I'm struggling here.
It is hard with Zoom sometimes, isn't it?
It really shouldn't be, and yet I've hid my controls. Who knows how to return the controls after you've hidden them?
Is Alt S the keyboard shortcut to stop sharing?
Great.
There we go. Great. All right. Perfect. All right, let's get started. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm on the forest team at Planet Labs. I'm a data scientist. Here's a map of above ground carbon density for the world. This is one of the things that our team generates. We call this our diligence data product. It's generated at an annual time step for every year, beginning in 2013. These are 30-meter pixels, and we estimate not only above ground carbon density, but also canopy height and canopy cover. I'm going to go through our pipeline at a super high level. We take imagery and other stuff, stack it all together into a data cube, and use those features to predict canopy cover and canopy height as measured by airborne LiDAR. And these are two independent models that we train. We're training these models using airborne LiDAR data that Ryan McCarthy, who's on this call and participating, has collected, processed, and curated. Essentially, we take the point clouds, generate rasters of canopy height and cover, and we've got pretty good coverage worldwide, although of course there's a lot of bias in where we have data and where we don't. But the basic task here is to take this feature cube, which includes data from Sentinel, Landsat, ALOS, Pulsar, and some other stuff, and map it to a one-channel raster of height or cover. And we use computer vision to do this because we think the spatial context is important in the inputs. And in particular, we're using a UNet, which is nothing fancy these days, but it's been around for a while. Instead of producing an output segmentation map, we just generate a one-channel raster where the values are either height or cover. Because a UNet needs to operate on image chips, we chip out the landscape into a bunch of small tiles. These tiles can be processed independently. We make predictions for each tile and then mosaic them together. And then we have a continuous map of height and cover for the world. We take those values for canopy cover and canopy height and use them to predict above ground carbon. And here we're going to be bringing in some spaceborne LiDAR data, the JEDI data that Tyler introduced earlier, which provides estimates, as he said, at 25-meter waveforms across the world. We don't have any data in boreal regions, but coverage elsewhere is pretty good. This is a map of JEDI data density. And so we've got data in places where we don't have really high quality field data or high quality airborne LiDAR data. Our model of above ground carbon is a waveform level model. And so the task here is for each waveform, We take an input feature vector shown on the left. This would include things like height and cover, as well as some other predictors. And we want to be able to map that feature vector to some continuous value of above ground carbon. Essentially, this is just a regression model. You can use any kind of regression model that you like. We evaluate performance on withheld data. This is our test set. And in general, the R-squared values for carbon density, height, and cover tend to hover around 0.8 or so. But we know that performance on the test set doesn't really tell the full story for users of our data. So one thing we spend a lot of time thinking about is how do we actually validate our estimates in the context of different use cases? So we have use cases related to carbon accounting, hazard assessment, and change detection. And depending on the use case, we may be focused on different values like height versus carbon and different spatial scales, maybe the pixel level versus a project versus an entire country. And so we think about use cases and come up with ways to validate those use cases using our data. I'll show one quick example from the California Air Resources Board, CARB. One thing CARB does is they have improved forest management projects. And for every one of those projects, you have to send people out into the field to do a field inventory that provides an estimate of the standing stock of carbon at the beginning of a project. And so this is like a totally independent field-derived estimate of carbon. We can compare it to our estimates. This plot, panel A, is showing the estimate of CO2 equivalent density over space. The x-axis is the field values, the y-axis is ours. You can look at the totals, and then we have data from across the US, so you can start to dig into different geographies. I'll call out some key challenges very briefly here. Data wrangling takes a ton of work and a ton of our time. Uncertainty quantification is really hard at scale, especially when you're using computer vision models. And then ensuring spatiotemporal coherence, also challenging when the inputs are imagery that's changing over years, and you've got clouds to grapple with as well. So I'll stop there. And special thanks to the Forests team. As I mentioned, Ryan is on this call. And if anyone wants to get in touch, please feel free to send me an email. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Max. So each of these presentations is just meant to give you a little bit of a sense of some different perspectives on forest carbon and get you thinking about different questions that you and your team might be interested in tackling during the Codefest. So for another perspective, we will turn to Nayani Alangakun, who is a research scientist here at the Earth Lab.
Thank you, Tyler. Good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to meet you all next week in person. I thought I should put my thoughts until we meet next week about the forest carbon based on the research that I did during last couple of years. So the two things come into my mind when I think about the forest carbon. One is the forest disturbance and the other one is the recovery. And I think like the forest recovery, post-disturbance recovery and the post-disturbance carbon recovery are exactly like identical twins. It's really hard to differentiate those two. And with the remote sensing plays a crucial role in determining or measuring the forest recovery. And like during the last 3-4 decades, like we have used like several metrics of remote sensing to monitor forest health and the forest recovery after disturbance. And also in the last few years that we have reached like milestone in remote sensing, especially like launching very high resolution hyperspectral LiDAR and also thermal sensors that could monitor Earth systems at global scale. So I think that now we are in an era that needs more robust ways that we could harness the technological development towards the monitoring of ecological recovery and resilience. So with like hands-on experience that I had during the past couple of years, and also the literature that I used for my research, it's mostly like the recovery is represented by the green recovery, basically like vegetation indices that is spectral characteristics that change over time. It could be the EVI, NDVI, or some other indices that especially characterize the greenness after disturbance. And also like with my research that here in the third figure, I use some structural variables like the canopy height from JEDI data. And however, still like when everything comes together, I see a common feature that we everything consider mostly surface characteristics. But when we go into the ecosystems, that I feel like, are we truly measuring what truly matters for the recovery? So especially for the forest ecosystems that we see like more than one layers. If we only see that top layer, the surface characteristics, then we are missing what actually that characterize that ecosystem, especially what it truly matters, like the ecosystem services functions, including the carbon recovery. So what I'm thinking is that in the current stage, our forest recovery metrics do represent these layers? Or do we need to find new metrics that can represent these layers? Or maybe some different methods that fuse different types of data fusion, or the machine learning or AI that can represent all these layers and can help truly identify the characteristic and the carbon recovery of these ecosystems. And the second thing I think is that the recovery is a successional process, and it takes time. And how much time it takes, that we don't know. It depends on different ecosystems. And along this pathway, along this pathway, they can have like many other disturbances can happen that can interfere this recovery process. So when we think of recovery metrics, can we differentiate the true recovery versus what is forced by the other disturbance or climate change, the droughts or the fires that interact with this along this pathway? So can we quantify the true recovery of that ecosystem versus the forces that given by the additional forces along with this recovery? So that's another thing that I had in my mind when I do my research. And the third thing is that can our metrics transit borders? So the disturbance transit border, we have fires that transit borders, we have climate change that affects everywhere in the world. So, but when we derive on remote sensing metrics to measure the recovery, are they transit borders? So most of the research that happens in the local scale that quantify the changes happening in the local scale. And then if we try to apply that same model, maybe with the same systems that with the same characteristics, that it gives maybe large uncertainty still. And also like the global scale models, that when we think about it, probably diminishes the local factors that affect in the recovery. So what I'm thinking is that, can we find a middle ground, or do we have that technology yet so that can translate that recovery matrix across these borders that count for both local and global scales? So in this one, I only talk about the above ground carbon, but there's a whole ton of things that are happening in the below ground carbon that also can affect all these recovery metrics. So I think based on this one, I think it's the time that we have to rethink of our remote sensing metrics that forest carbon in the forest carbon monitoring. So I think now I should stop, hoping to meet you all in next week. And probably we will have some time to harness the power of remote sensing towards the measuring what actually truly matters for the recovery, the carbon. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Mayani. And our next perspective is from Ashley Woolman, who is with the Colorado State Forest Service.
Okay, can you guys see my screen? Can you hear me okay? Great. My name is Ashley Woolman. I work for the Colorado State Forest Service as the Forest Carbon Specialist. My position is housed in our Science and Data Division. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our statewide forest carbon inventory. So a quick background on Colorado State Forest Service. We are the lead state agency for forestry and wildfire expertise in Colorado. Here's a picture of a recent timber thinning operation out of our Durango field office in Southwest Colorado. It was a project focused on fuel mitigation. We have a lot of really great partnerships across the state, and this was just an example where everything lined up really well with where cut timber was loaded onto the train that runs between Silverton and Durango on their flat cars, and then was later transferred to trucks and multiple wood utilization businesses across the Durango region. So just a creative way where we were able to pull biomass out of the forest for fuel mitigation work and get it into local businesses. Our mission at Colorado State Forest Service is to achieve stewardship of Colorado's diverse forest environments for the benefit of present and future generations. We are the Division of Forestry for the Colorado DNR, and we're actually housed in CSU, Colorado State University. We apply science for on-the-ground stewardship and management, as well as fuels reduction and wildfire mitigation assistance. In 2022, Colorado passed House Bill 221012, which directed our agency with developing a carbon accounting framework. It defined a carbon accounting framework as using the USDA's U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis Program that Tyler mentioned earlier, to develop tabular data of carbon flux and stock estimates across the whole state of Colorado, across all forest types, and then also ownerships and carbon pools. So not just above ground forest carbon, but below ground, soil, live and dead, and all the other ones out there. This has been a main focus for me in the past year, and it's exciting. We are going to be able to release the report in the coming months, and I can talk a little bit about some of the results at the Codefest. We were able to account for individual tree growth, removals, and mortality using on-the-ground field measurements from field data collected from 2002 to 2019. So something that's become really apparent in our results when we look at a analysis this large across the whole state and across various counties and regions is that the variability of forest carbon is influenced by a multitude of factors. So these are just some of the factors that we were able to account for in our analysis. They include individual tree species, the forest age and structure, soil, climate conditions, regen dynamics, topography and aspect, land ownership, land use changes, so forest to non-forest, forest to different land uses, and the footprints of previous management and disturbance impacts. And so within each one of these, it's important to consider the error and uncertainty and how that gets presented in results. Another theme that keeps coming up in our report is that any inventory or analysis such as this is just a snapshot in time of the current conditions, which is relatively a pretty short time span. And so when we assess carbon dynamics before and after disturbances, it's important to consider what your baseline is versus what your reference carbon stock levels are versus what historical stock levels might have been. And so in Colorado, we are typically assessing very overstocked, very dense wildfire and insect and disease prone forests. And so we keep finding that, you know, these carbon quantities themselves are not indicators of what a healthy or resilient or a functioning ecosystem is. And so working for an applied stewardship and management agency, I am always thinking about how our science and our findings can inform on the ground work. And so things to consider with remote sensing products is, does this data need validation? Do the results actually reflect what is on the ground? And how can we bridge the gap between on the ground knowledge that our foresters across the state have and what we like to call the technology wizards that are out there? And so in what ways can our research translate to field management practices that focus on carbon and resilient forests? And that's all I have.
you so much, Ashley. That was fantastic. Next up, we have Sarah Hart, who is a professor at CSU.
Okay, am I sharing my screen now or no? Still, okay. Hmm. Sorry, CSU doesn't usually let us use Zoom, so I'm having to get system preferences updated. I gotta
Maybe,
leave and then join again.
cool. Maybe we'll
Sorry.
have Alex start, and then you can go right after Alex.
Yep.
Alex, are you ready to go?
I hope so. I might have the same problem, but let's try.
Cool. And this is Alex Virod from B0 Carbon.
Is this working? Oh, brilliant. All right. The slideshow. Cool. Hi, everyone. So I'm Alex, yeah, from B0 Carbon, where I'm a remote sensing scientist. I'm going to talk about Earth observation and the voluntary carbon market, and particularly about like how it applies to nature-based solutions. So B0 are a carbon ratings agency. And what that means is that we look at carbon credit projects that are selling their credits on the voluntary carbon market, and we assess the likelihood that each of those credits sold is going to result in the 1 ton of carbon removal or the avoided 1 ton of carbon emissions that it's associated to. So we have a scale that's kind of similar to these like debt rating agencies, where projects that are very well thought out and that are very well implemented get a very high score, where, you know, you're saying like there's a 0.9 chance that that ton is going to be a ton, down to the lower end where there's a lot of risk associated with the projects going on. We don't just do nature-based projects, but they're a big part of the portfolio. And we look all around the world at what's going on and try and help investors put together a balanced and risk managed portfolio of carbon offsets so they can plan effectively. When it comes down to nature-based solutions, we use Earth observation and geospatial analysis a lot. Like particularly, we have like a toolkit we've put together that's built on open and proprietary data sources. So all of the satellite data products that Tyler was talking about earlier, for example. And we use these to investigate like what's going on the ground versus what's being reported. And when we're looking at projects, I think like we look at a lot of different, like I guess you could say risk factors, but the 3 that are probably the most relevant to what's going on here are additionality. So that's like when a project is being set up to sell credits, are the carbon offsets that are being sold, like would that have occurred without the project there? So was carbon finance necessary for the project to happen? And would say like in a restoration project, would this area have recovered naturally anyway? Questions like that. We also look at overcrediting. So we do a lot of work creating forest measurement products, looking at carbon stock assessment, ongoing monitoring of areas to see if there's any changes occurring. Like if an area is avoided deforestation, it's saying it's protected. Are there new roads appearing? Is there deforestation going on? And we also look at non-permanence risk, which is probably the most relevant to what we'll be doing next week, where it's the risk that a carbon credit that's been sold might actually become invalid in the future because of a deforestation event or, you know, like a forest fire. So I guess I don't really need to tell anybody about this, but there's obviously an increasing the extreme fire season occurring in the US as a result probably of climate change. And that's been all over the media. There's a lot of carbon credit projects set up in the Western US that have since caught fire. And that kind of creates the questions that we're interested in, which is, what is the role of carbon markets in this? Is there one? Like they're a useful tool to provide funding for forest management and for conservation efforts, but can they be used effectively if this kind of uptick in fire occurrence is causing emissions associated with these forests that are having credits sold against them? And we had kind of like three main lines of questioning we were interested in when we thought about this. The first was like, okay, so there are lots of management actions that can be implemented to either mitigate the impacts of fire or to speed up recovery, things like this. Like what is out there that could benefit from carbon finance, and how can you measure and validate those approaches to ensure that they're effective and to ensure that money's going in the right direction? The second is that carbon markets, they need to be transparent. Like ideally the data around them are open and available, so that everybody, like third parties, can come in and assess their efficacy. So what would the next generation monitoring products look like? What are the limitations of the satellites that we have available, the satellite data that we have available at the minute for keeping track of things? And in the case of like, there's lots of new sensors coming out, like JEDI came out in 2019, right? But what are the limitations when we're starting to look back further? And then the final one was like the risk environment is obviously changing with this uptick in forest fire occurrence. And how can we factor that into our ratings, and how can we work with project developers to make sure that they account for those risks appropriately? It's usually done with a buffer pool. Cool. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Alex. Sarah, did you make it back?
I'm back. Let me try this again. Okay, how about now? Okay,
Yeah.
Awesome, cool. Well, hi everyone, I'm Sarah Hart. I'm an assistant professor at CSU in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department. And basically, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what my lab group does here. And I should clarify that it's more of a boutique lab than the Earth Lab. We're a little bit smaller. I jokingly call us the Humans Are Researching Trees Lab. And fundamentally, we're motivated by trying to understand disturbances, interactions between disturbances, kind of what the consequences are for forest ecosystems, and how those may or may not feed back to and influence global change. And then broadly, what people can do to kind of think about how their actions may influence parts of the system, whether through forest management activities or other actions. To kind of address these questions, we use a lot of different approaches because disturbances unfold oftentimes over really long time scales, but kind of unfold over broad spatial scales. We do everything from remote sensing and broad scale GIS work to looking at forest inventory data from projects like FIA. We do some experimental field manipulations, surveys, lots of different things, and some simulation modeling. And most of our work to date has focused on forests here in Western North America, predominantly here in the Southern Rockies. Okay, so I'm going to go real broad, as this is going to show that I'm the academic of the group who thinks less about products and more about uncertainties. And having participated in some of these activities before with the Earth Lab, one of the things that I've always really valued is the opportunity to work with a whole bunch of folks who have awesome skill sets and different backgrounds. So I'm going to present you with some questions that I have in hopes that y'all can help answer them for me, because I don't have the time these days. Okay, so first, one of the things that really motivates me is understanding how things like interactions between disturbances might influence forest carbon dynamics. And so in particular, my lab has been working a lot along with other folks across the West to try and understand things like what are the implications of insect outbreaks of multiple different species on how forests function, with understanding that a lot of our forest disturbances, in particular insects and pathogens, are specific to one tree species or genus, And we're observing that there tends to be this pattern where there's increases in the overlap between lots of different insects across the West. And so we suspect that that may be compromising the ability or capacity of forests to recover or compensate for loss of one tree species by other species that may be present within the landscape. So we're kind of interested in questions like that. We're also interested in thinking about fuel treatment. So building off of some of the work that was just talked about with thinking about the risk of fire here in the Western US. In particular, we're interested in trying to understand when fuel treatments might have positive effects on forest carbon stores, which may emerge as a product of reducing the risk of severe wildfire. And when they may have negative effects, because most fuel treatments focus on reducing stand density, which tends to lead to overall decreases in above ground carbon storage. So trying to figure out kind of what the trade-offs are there and where and when the balance shifts, we're very interested in. We're interested in thinking similarly about post-fire restoration treatments and things like tree planting. Across the Western US and globally, there's been this move to increase the amount of trees that we have in systems. But we know that here in the Western US, in parts of our dry forests, increases in tree density can be associated with decreases in resistance and resilience to things like wildfire, insect outbreaks, and drought. So where and when and how can we perform tree planting activities that may be aligned with restoration efforts to try to consider the carbon impacts? Oh, thought I had one more, but the last one I was just going to add is, given that my role here at CSU is also predominantly in teaching the next generation of forest managers, one of the things that I'm also interested in is trying to figure out how to prepare students, particularly undergraduate students, with the capacity to think about these issues and leverage some of the existing data and tools that are out there. So that's all I got, and I'm looking forward to meeting y'all in Boulder in just a couple days here, I guess now. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. And then finally, we have Carol Westman from here at CU Boulder. Carol, we would love to get some of your perspective on sort of where this all takes us to.
All right. Now, I may run into the same problem as Sarah did. Let's see. Oh, and it gave me the system preferences as well. Tyler, do you want to go ahead since we're running a little behind? Yeah, we planned ahead on this a little bit.
Here you go.
Excellent. Oh, this is good. All right. So I'm here to kind of provide a segue to, after these great examples, listening to all those, well, it's just so exciting to see what's going on. And I want to sort of take us back to the overarching motivation, if you will, for why we're not why we're looking at forest carbon. I think that's too obvious, but how we've looked at it and maybe some of the frontiers here. So next one. So overall, I want to define the ground I want to urge you to define the ground you're standing on. I'll speak to each of these a little bit more. The forest carbon dynamics, what do we need to know in order to quantify and value this? And some key questions remaining for science and applied science. Of course, these are all bullets and are far greater exaggerations of what I'm really going to be telling you, but we'll take this as an outline. Next. So first, Tyler had phrased it this way a while back when we were talking about wanting you all to define the ground you're standing on. You've got a very short period of time to investigate, and rather than investigate some of these tools, so rather than just going hog wild, define what you're interested in and find some tractable questions or approaches that you can explore in a very short period of time. There's always time afterwards to do this, but make some progress on something that can set a trajectory for you that is of interest to you and explores questions that you're ultimately trying to answer. Next. Oh, yeah. Okay, so cross time, the history of forest carbon research has covered the gamut, of course, as we increase our knowledge, as we increase our technology. And after pondering this a bit, we've kind of taken three approaches, all of which are still active, by the way. We've looked at potential carbon, what would grow and where, what are the climate constraints for vegetation growth, and how are humans changing that in kind of a cookie cutter fashion, if you will. Still work going in this area on how best to do this. I mean, I found a 23 paper on this. So this is still a motivation. Then there is recognition that carbon is in fact dynamic, and these snapshots aren't necessarily going to be representative of a whole heck of a lot if we don't recognize that the vegetation will be growing, obviously, and changing in structure and mass, and succession occurs. So we have these stages of change as well. On that, and this is kind of following the history of ecology as well, if you're have looked at some of this. Finally, the disturbed carbon is in recognition that we don't have just natural dynamics in the sense of growth and succession and all, but we in fact have disturbances, both internal to a system that is natural in its regime, as well as the disturbances that occur via environmental changes that are happening and are continuing to increase. So the questions in disturbed carbon are, what is the change going on right now, and how do we anticipate future change? So these are the three frameworks. Next. I'm just going to focus in on that last one, given that we are interested in disturbance, and in fact, with my bias, this is what we have to be looking at. Forests are reorganizing given global environmental change, both in structure and composition. And these are some bullets of kind of pulling down some of the main lessons that we've learned, that with these more frequent and severe disturbances that we're living with, forests are becoming younger and more open. We're seeing these structural changes happening. Climatic extremes increasingly favor trees with lower stature, both the fact that with these disturbances, we aren't getting necessarily the old growth that we used to have, but we're also getting species that are adapting to changing conditions. Fourth, composition is shifting toward more warm adapted and drought tolerant species at both local to global scales. So we're seeing changes in composition and communities that are and can be profound. in all of this, we might be crossing important thresholds, namely that areas cannot necessarily support previous composition that had adapted there, or that we are moving to non-forest conditions, i.e. we're experiencing regime shifts. And next slide. So this is a bit of a messy slide. I'm really glad that we had these previous talks, because they gave a lot of examples of really what's going on. And what I'm picked up here was more some of the future thinking of how we are going to how best to direct our focus. This was a paper by Seidel and Turner just a couple years ago, which takes the adaptive cycle by Halling, which describes the dynamics of ecology. And without going into that in detail, if you see on the lower right-hand quadrant, the adaptive cycle describes these four phases of post-disturbance, reorganization, and reestablishment and concentration of resources, etc. What Seidel and Turner are looking at is the quadrant on reorganization, and saying this particular phase is going to be critical for forest development, and it is that time period that will give us most opportunity to look at what future forest conditions can be. So here they talk about these four major pathways through which forests can persist but reorganize. So we maintain forests. We are not changing regimes. So we can change the forest structure, which all of these previous speakers have addressed: the number, the size, the spatial arrangement of trees. We can see a pathway where composition changes, that the biodiversity is actually adjusting, if you will. We can also see in terms of resilience that there's no change in the structure and composition, or there are some restructuring that goes on, but the forest functions the same. Or we can see reassembly, compositional changes, or replacement, namely we're changing the type of system that is there. So the reason I bring this up is because it offers a really good framework to start to pose the questions and what the metrics are that you could look at with these huge data sets that are available to you. Next slide. Another figure that they had in this kind of established something that was sort of the basis of what Diana was speaking to, namely this reorganization process, the recovery, and what are the traits that are influential, imperative to move from one stage to the next. So looking at this little diagram, that we've got the disturbance that happens, we have a real change in what is there. Contingent, the future system is reliant on reproductive strategies, the establishment of those reproductive attempts, namely that they set in and they offer to grow, and then the modification over time, either through the growth and normal organization of a forest, or modification through human intervention, etc. So it's these processes that are going to influence reorganization and then the ultimate force that you've got. And this line on the bottom, looking at the traits that modulate the processes of establishment and growth, and they determine the pathway. So that reorganization phase, that window, then will give us the future. And looking at how that window organizes, those pathways will help us anticipate what the future changes. So that in a real nutshell are some of the ways that we can start to apply some of the products that you can develop through time series analysis, through spatial analysis of the data to get at futures, if you will. Next slide. Just as a slip in, and I'm so glad Alex spoke to this already, about carbon accounting and all aspects of carbon accounting that have to be considered to make that a viable solution. This is just one thing that I saw that I thought, this is stuff you all could play with your data sets. Approaching baselines, which was one bullet in Alex's presentation. The American Forest Foundation, Nature Conservancy, and Terra Carbon are looking at dynamic baselines and how do we go beyond a static baseline, which can change and which may not be representative, in short, of an allocation that we want to put into the market. And they've got in this diagram this idea that if you'll look at it, it is sort of analogous to some of your remote sensing classes. If you've done any remote sensing, which I imagine most of you have, where you've got your region of interest, and to validate that, to set up a baseline for any change in your region of interest, you look at the surrounding similar forests and sample from those. And so they're basically saying, establish your background dynamically, and then watch the dynamics within your managed system to look for the increases in carbon or decreases in carbon that you're after in your management process. So determining a match, looking at those outside plots, if you will, have to be based on a number of variables, and they're stating a minimum of 14 variables, which will allow it to be representative of your experimental allocation. And some of these I've listed, we have in these bigger data layers. And so you could use this as a possibility to explore how well does that work? What are going to be the constraints on that sort of approach to calculating carbon benefits? Okay, next, got to keep moving. So this paper, going back to the one looking at this window of reorganization, in particular, Seidel and Turner posed a whole slew of questions, and I just wanted to put up a few of these that might help drive some of your thinking as you look for some projects, both now and future. But how long is this window? At what point does the window close? When do we say that this reorganization has stopped and we're in a relative equilibrium, at least for a time, of a forest? What is the role of compounding and linked disturbances in reorganization, i.e., this is some of the work that Sarah's doing, for sure. How do these disturbances influence the trajectory, the pathways of reorganization? Is there a consistent sequence of change in the different pathways? Do they operate at the same speed? Do some come on a little slower? Are there characteristics of the pathways themselves that can give you a rough estimate of their trajectory? Where are the thresholds for changes in forest structure and composition? Can we see some indicator of when the disturbances were just too much and the composition couldn't restore, and so forth? What are the implications of reorganization for forest functioning and ecosystem services? At what point does that change enough that you don't get the services, which includes carbon, in the future? And to what extent can forest reorganization be managed, and how, which is very, very much a key question in our carbon markets, for sure. Next slide. So the question posed at the launch for you were these, and I'll go through them really quickly to remind you. Jennifer spoke of these on your first virtual. How does spatial and temporal scale of disturbance impact above ground forest carbon in the short and long term? To look at that, this window of reorganization following this disturbance, so that's across time and in space, can give some insights into this. How do interactions between multiple disturbances impact forest carbon recovery trajectories? Same, what I just said. How do disturbances drive ecosystem transformations? And how can we best model the impacts of future transformations on above ground carbon stocks? Again, there's anticipation of the future structure and composition and the consequent carbon stocks. Finally, what are the ways in which we may best improve above ground carbon data sets and models? So all of this, including some of the questions that she asked you to generate on your own, can help you form your envelope, basically, to constrain you to some more tractable snippets of that would lead towards answering some of these questions. Next one. Thanks, Tyler. So considering all of this, and those, I just urge you to keep in mind that and again, our examples were all addressing this. What is the composition and structure? How do your data sets lead you into the traits that are associated with those properties? Landscape structure, which involves this spatial component. How is it structured? What is the patchiness of the landscape? What is the connectivity? How does that influence trajectories of recovery? How does it determine trajectories of recovery and their success? I think is that my last one? Yeah. Oh, and I remember I added one more of the one that I couldn't bring up, and that was, first and foremost, always remember the scales that you're considering, so that the influence of these properties may actually change with increasing scale, and the data sets that you have will be at certain scales, which certainly will be able to tell you some things over other things, depending on what area they're dealing with. So in any case, that is a snippet of the forest carbon science that I'm considering relevant, and I hope that this workshop really goes well for you and you glean a lot. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Carol. That was awesome. So we don't have as much time as we had hoped here at the end, but we're still gonna create some breakout rooms that you can go to really just get a sense of who is on your team. We, at this point, mostly want you to just know, what is the expertise of some of the people in the room, and what in general are people interested in. And we want that to allow you to do just a little bit of subconscious work between now and the Code Fest, so that you've spent a little bit of time sitting with the information and who's going to be around you, so that on Tuesday of next week, you can really, yeah, get going with some great brainstorming. So if you all can sort of introduce yourselves to one another in your breakout rooms, we'll have rooms 1 through 6. And then, yeah, if you can also introduce yourselves in the Slack channel, given that we have a few people who aren't here, I'll send instructions out after that. But we won't call you back. And yeah, I just created 6 breakout rooms. We'll do team 1 to room 1 and so on. And yeah, we can't wait to see you on Tuesday. All right, breakout rooms should be opened.
Hey, Tyler, I missed your explanations. So if I'm in team 1, which room should I go to?
Room 1.
Room 1? Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't remember what team I'm in.
Alex, you are on.
Is it 1?
Yep, you're on team 1.
Awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Carol. That was awesome.
You're muted, Carol.
Whoops. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look at those system settings. I'm glad Sarah had the same problem. Oh, these academics, man, we've got to get out in the real world, don't we? Well, thanks so much, and good luck with all of this. I hadn't anticipated